Good morning. Welcome to our first lecture on Brokeback Mountain, the short story by Annie Proulx. And this is part of, obviously you could read Brokeback Mountain or watch the film as part of a number of different sorts of modules: contemporary literature modules, 20th century literature modules, American literature modules, or even modules that combine the analysis of literature and film. So for our purposes, this is part of, we understand Brokeback Mountain as part of our module on late 20th century American literature. The title of my lecture today is Family, Fame, and the American Frontier. And those are the things that I will pretty much talk to you about today. Who Annie Proulx is, how she's developed a little bit as a writer, and what some of the themes are in this short story, Brokeback Mountain. So let's begin. Who is Annie Proulx? Why am I asking this question? I think very often with literature, it's really interesting to have a sense of where an author comes from, what their personal context or perhaps familial contexts are, because of course, especially with living writers, and Annie Proulx is definitely a living writer, this has had an influence on the sorts of things that they create for our consumption as readers and as analysts of literature. So this isn't any longer available, but I found some very interesting information on a website that she had, and it's just, you just can't access it anymore, so you'll just have to trust me on this. But she begins her, this is fascinating, she begins her website biography in 1637, but she never mentions her date of birth. So she's calling it a biography, she doesn't mention her date of birth, and she sets it several centuries in the past. Instead of emphasizing herself, there's great emphasis on her ancestors and her various family members' migrations, and how her own life and family connections implicitly inform her work, i.e. her writing. So for instance, I'm going to read you a long quote here, and I was going to do PowerPoint, but I just got a little bit frustrated with it last night, so we're just going back to, well, not quite old-fashioned blackboard, but an old-fashioned whiteboard and marker. But this is too long of a quote for me to write down. That would just take forever. So this is what she writes about her mother's family. My mother was intensely shy, and like her best friend and sister, Gloriana, was a gifted amateur painter and naturalist. Their mother, Sarah Geer Jill, was a wonderful storyteller, inventing characters and exciting episodes as she spoke, many of the tales based on the foibles and habits of her children. From my painter mother, I inherited or learned the art of observation, and from my maternal grandmother, who washed and ironed all of her paper money, I picked up some facility in shaping a story and the exercise of the imagination. When I was a child, it was called lying. I was a liar. Now, this is a delightful passage. I really wish her website was still viable, but it's not, because it was full of these sorts of, really odd tidbits about family life and just in the incredible cast of characters that she describes as her family. But it sounds, this is something that, for those of you who are doing 19th century American literature, you might want to think of this in relationship to somebody like Mark Twain, who was very famous for cataloging lies and liars, and that's an interesting aspect of American literary tradition, that idea of spinning a yarn or telling a tall tale. So she is telling us that in this biography, this so-called biography that begins in 1637 and doesn't give us her date of birth, that she was a liar. And that is an important component of being, or at least in her family, was an important component of being a storyteller. So that could be interesting. That could be interesting in your evaluation of her style and perhaps what she's attempting to do in her stories. For those of you, and it is important. I just want to remind you, we'll talk about this further in seminar. But you want to read beyond Brokeback Mountain. You don't only want to read Brokeback Mountain. You want to read beyond it as much as possible. So back to Annie Proulx. And by the way, that's how you pronounce her name. It's spelled Proulx, but we do not pronounce the X. We do not pronounce the L. It is Annie Proulx. That's actually also on her website, but you can't access. She is the mother of 4 children, and she was married 3 times between the 1950s and the 1980s. She says that it gradually dawned on her that she wasn't well suited to marriage. So that, there's this sort of humor that is, woven in and out of the way in which she speaks about herself. But she also, outside of this sort of humorous voice, there is a very serious voice about her own development as a writer. And she began as a journalist, and then she moved on to short stories, and then she attempted novels, which I think is also interesting for those of you who are doing combined degrees in literature and creative writing, or are doing whole degrees in creative writing. That idea of moving through genres and finding her feet in particular genres before attempting the next one, which again is particular to her. That's not a recipe for how anybody should do things, but it is interesting to hear how some people have chosen to work or have developed as writers. Interestingly, her writing life emerged quite late in her life, and it emerged after she abandoned the idea of being an academic. And so she went very far in that particular ambition, and was studying to do a PhD in history, and got up until the penultimate task of actually writing the dissertation before she changed course and went into journalism. So here's another long quote which talks about that, what that meant, that PhD in history meant to her, what stayed with her as a writer. Excuse me 1 second. This is Proulx. I studied history at the University of Vermont from 1966 to 1969, and I graduated cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa, and then went on to graduate school in Montreal at Sir George Williams University, which has now been renamed Concordia University, and without ever knowing who this Sir George had been. I took an MA degree in 1973, these are giving us some clues to her age, by the way, and passed my doctoral orals in 1975. My fields of study were Renaissance economic history, I didn't know that was a field of study, the Canadian North, and traditional China. The disparate subjects suited my interest, as did the department's leaning towards the Annales School of History. I'll just write that down. Annales, this is a French word. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but some of you will be familiar with it, although she goes along to describe it. With the Annales School of History associated with Braudel, Bloch, and Febvre. At the time, the great scholar Georges Roudet, he wrote The Crowd in History, was in residence. All this was invaluable training for novel writing, and it set my approach to fiction forever. Okay, all of this stuff about history and the way in which she learned history. That is, the examination of the lives of individuals against the geography and longue durée of events. That is, that time and place are major determining factors in human life. So the way in which, that's the end of the quote, the way in which she trained as a scholar, potentially to become a teacher of history, stayed with her in her development as a writer. So that's, and I think what we can take from that particular quote is sort of the lives of everyday people were of concern to these major historians like Braudel, Bloch, and Febvre, and the lives of everyday ordinary people are the characters that you're going to find in Annie Proulx's short stories and novels. Okay, Annie Proulx is quite prolific as a writer. You probably will have noticed that Brokeback Mountain is part of a collection of stories, Close Range, Wyoming Stories, published in 1999. Bad Dirt is also in the Wyoming Stories series, published in 2004. The Shipping News, I'm pretty sure she won the Pulitzer for the Shipping News. I have to double check that, although maybe one of you can look that up. The Shipping News, and of course that was made into a film with, gosh, who was that? I think it was Kevin Spacey, maybe. I think it was Kevin Spacey. So that is, as a text, published in 1993. And I'll just put one more down. I'm running out of room. Postcards, very interesting, actually. I haven't read it, but very interesting, just sort of in terms of Brokeback Mountain and the significance of the postcard at the end. I hope I'm not, well, you will have read the story, but that might be interesting to look at. But there's many more. She's just come out with a new nonfiction book. I can't remember the title of it, but it was written up in the, it was reviewed in The Guardian. It wasn't a very good review. Sort of about houses, the houses that she's lived in. Anyway, very prolific. She's a very prolific writer. Really didn't start writing until she was over 50, and has enjoyed and continues to enjoy great success as a writer. Very, very important in the context of contemporary American literature. And well, they're doing some sort of construction here. They're always doing some sort of construction. I think it's new windows at the moment. But anyway, she. When I was talking about lying and her humorous side and connecting her to Mark Twain, she's clearly a writer who reads. She also understands the sort of major features of the American literary tradition, and I think that will become clearer as we explore some of the key themes of Brokeback Mountain. And obviously we'll explore this in more depth in seminar. But let's just set out a few of the major themes of Brokeback Mountain now for you to contemplate in advance of seminar. We could certainly say that masculinity is a key theme. Yeah, masculinity. We could certainly say that sexuality is a key theme. And we could certainly, let me just fill in that little bullet point there. And we could certainly say that homophobia. And of course we have our main characters. We've got Jack, Twist, and Ennis Del Mar. And they both are, we meet them when they're very young. Well, we follow them through their lives as young men and as they move into middle age, so that they're actually charting and discovering and defining for themselves and being defined by their context in terms of what masculinity means and how masculinity is to be manifested. Sexuality in terms of heterosexuality, and homosexuality, and they both sort of are certainly not going to talk about that out loud, but there is this intense, in addition to sexuality, there is love and emotion and companionship. But these three, and certainly the fear of homosexuality, the homophobia, all these three things are very tightly and intricately woven together by Prue. In terms of that everyday context, the lives of these young men in the 1960s, and so unpicking how these themes work in the story is your job, or our job collectively, in seminar and eventually in your essays, if you choose to write on the essay question devoted to Brokeback Mountain. Right, so those are some of the key themes. In addition to the themes, right, in addition to ways of thinking through what the story is about, we also want to think about, and we'll do this with all the texts in this module, in fact we'll do this pretty much with all the texts that you do in the degree, is we also want to think about how the story is told. We want to think about the formal attributes of the story. So what are some of the formal attributes? Now, I did find some really, really good images of the sort of Western Plains and Wyoming, but I just didn't have time to get them onto the PowerPoint and figure out how it all works. But the landscape is almost a character unto itself in this story. The way in which Prue uses dialogue is very sparingly. So we might say there's very sparse dialogue. It's a very long short story, but it's a short story nonetheless. But we follow these young men into their middle age, and so it's a very protracted time frame. So some short stories might take place over a day. Some novels might take place over a lifetime. This is a short story that combines those, what we perhaps, the way in which we stereotypically think of a short story. So it stretches across a whole big time frame. The other thing that you might not have picked up upon, but I'd like you now, after lecture, to go back and think about, is the way in which silence is used in the text. Silence and also the inability to speak, and connect that to what I had up here a few minutes ago in terms of the way in which Prue weaves together masculinity and homophobia and sexuality, and the ways in which Ennis and Jack really don't have a way of talking these things through. And in that sense, this story is very much of the era in which it's set. This is not the Oprah age that these young men live in. And that is absolutely not an aspect of masculinity, to actually talk about your feelings. And that's, of course, a major conflict in the story when there's a confrontation between the two of them about their feelings. So just finishing up quickly, how might we begin to analyze this story? These are some questions that you might begin with, and I might in fact put to you in seminar. How did Jack Twist and Ennis Del Mar negotiate the idea of family and the idea of love? And what is it in their personal histories? Because we do get some backstory to these two people. What is it in their personal histories that helps to determine the way in which they think about family and love? So finally, the last thing, going back to the title here, Family, Fame, and the American Frontier. Really grossly, I think, really inaccurately, the film version of this was called the gay cowboy film. Obviously they're not cowboys, they're sheep herders. But there is there is a way in which Prue is attempting to subvert the myth of the American West. My back is really hurting. Oh, did you hear that? Crack. Oh, God. Anyway, she's subverting the myth of the American West and sort of this idea of man's mastery of the physical landscape. She's dealing with and playing with the myth of the American cowboy, that idea of macho and powerfulness, and the violence and danger inherent in these myths, and in the way in which they constrict lives and constrict relationships. So that this idea of the American frontier is very, very central to the story, and I want that to be. And it's subtle. You have to understand what that myth is and how it operates to understand how she's subverting it. So that's your work. That's the work that's before you. Thank you very much.